Hey everyone, Vince with Boomer Electronics here. Hope you're all having a nice day. Today I'm going to be going over fixing a Game Gear. This one's going to be a little different today though, because I bought a Game Gear that had already been recapped but was not working properly. So I thought this would make a good video to go over the things you can check if you are in this situation where you recap your Game Gear and for whatever reason it isn't working. I'm going to be steering this video more towards beginners who don't work on these very much, who maybe don't have too much experience working on electronics. So the only tool you're going to need for diagnostics is just a multimeter, and you should know how to use it in continuity mode, the beeping mode when you put your probes together. So with all that said, let's get into the listing and show you what I got. Here's the Game Gear that I purchased. As you can see on this last photo here, it was indeed recapped. I'll go over how that job looks in a little while, but yeah, was fully recapped it looks like. They did include a photo showing just a few horizontal lines up here. Horizontal lines are good. If you see vertical lines on the screen's probably faulty. Horizontal lines usually go away once you recap it, so that was a good sign. Then going down to the item description. System powers up for half a second, then immediately shuts off. System has already had the capacitors replaced, but the solder job looks extremely amateurish and could maybe revived by a more skilled technician. Yeah, so that's what I ended up getting. So let's get into it. This should go without saying, but the first thing you're going to want to double and triple check is your work. I would go ahead and look at the capacitors you solder down, make sure the polarity is correct on all of them if you're using electrolytics, like this Game Gear was. If for some reason you use very long capacitor legs, like was done on this Game Gear, now may be a good opportunity for you to go back and desolder those, trim the legs down and solder them back onto the board. There's really no reason to have long legs, you're just introducing more ways to cause short circuits. It's very easy for these very long capacitor legs to accidentally touch something on the board and cause the Game Gear to not work. Speaking of short circuits, I would also check around where you soldered your capacitors and make sure there aren't any random solder blobs or anything like that on the board. On this Game Gear, there actually was a solder blob shorting ground to the 34-volt rail, which is why it was turning off after half a second. Now that you've double checked your work and your Game Gear still isn't working correctly, how you proceed is going to depend on the exact issues you're having. If your Game Gear is not staying powered on, I would recommend that you verify your power board is working correctly as the next step. To do this, disconnect the power board from the main board, plug in your AC adapter and switch the power board on. Put your multimeter into DC voltage mode, then we're going to check for the voltages shown in the diagram here. So place your ground probe on any of pins 3, 4, or 5 as shown here, and then pins 1 and 2 with your red probe should measure 5 volts. Pin 6 should be the V reference, which should measure about 1.28 volts. Pin 7 should be whatever your power adapter is putting out, so around 9 to 12 volts depending on what kind of power adapter you're using exactly. And then the last pin over there should give you 34 volts. If you're getting all those voltages, then your power board is most likely fine and the issue is on your motherboard somewhere. However, if you aren't getting these voltages, then there's likely an issue with your power board and you'll either have to repair it or replace it with another one to proceed further. Note that if you're working on a VA4 model Game Gear, then you may not be able to check your power board in this way. Additionally, it's not uncommon for the connector that connects the main board to the power board to have issues. On this particular Game Gear, you can see there is actually corrosion on the first 3 pins of this connector. If you run into a situation like this, or if your Game Gear is powering on and off consistently and you notice jiggling that cable seems to cause some issues, you're either going to have to replace this connector. Alternatively, you can just hardwire the power board to the main board and continue to troubleshoot this way. Hopefully at this point you're able to get your Game Gear to at least stay powered on. Regardless of what the Game Gear is doing at this point, I would recommend as a next step to thoroughly look over the motherboard for any damaged vias and traces. The vias and traces on the main board are often damaged by the old capacitors leaking their fluid all over the place, and sometimes by batteries as well. Here's an example of a healthy looking via. You can see it's very nice and golden colored. And right next to it we have a bad looking via. These ones that are very darkened like this, I would check all these with your multimeter in continuity mode. To do this, you're going to need to have the motherboard completely removed from the shell. Press your probe into the via. Then on the other side of the board in the exact same location is going to be the exit of that via. You're going to put your other probe into that side of the via. If you hear a beep on your multimeter here, that means that that via is okay and you can proceed to checking other vias that look damaged. However, if you do find a via that does not have continuity across the board, then that via is damaged and is going to need to be repaired. To repair these vias, I use a pair of ultrafine tweezers, some 30 gauge Kynar wire, solder, flux, and of course a soldering iron. I poke through the via with my tweezers, then I insert the 30 gauge Kynar wire. I will then scratch away at the traces leading up to the vias on each side of the board, apply flux and solder to the exposed traces, then solder the 30 gauge Kynar wire down to each trace on each side of the board. And your via should be repaired at this point. So once you made it this far, the next thing you're going to want to check is to see if your Game Gear is booting games or not. I'm going to strongly recommend that you have a known working cartridge for this, and if you haven't done so recently, you might want to give that cartridge a good cleaning. If you're having video issues, the easiest way to see if a game is booting is through audio. This is assuming that you have done a relatively decent job recapping the audio board. If you aren't hearing any audio through the speaker and you have a pair of wired headphones available, I would recommend that you plug those in and check for audio through the headphones as well, just to be safe that you're exhausting all of your options. If after doing all of this there's still no indication that your Game Gear is booting games, then the next thing we're going to do is check for continuity between the cartridge pin slots and various areas on the board, as I'll show you now. For the next step, I would recommend that you check for continuity between the cartridge connector and the RAM chip. If you have a 2 ASIC model, you will also want to check for continuity between the cartridge connector and the Z80 processor. Here are some photos I've taken from the Retro 6 wiki. So as an example, for the 1 ASIC model Game Gear, you can see pin 4 from the left on the cartridge connector is A12. So in the photo of the RAM chip, you can see on the right side, second one from the bottom is A12. That means we should be getting continuity from pin 4 on the cartridge connector to that pin on the RAM chip. If you are not getting continuity there, that means there's a break in that connection. You're either going to have to run a jumper wire from A12 on the RAM chip to A12 on the cartridge connector, or you're going to have to trace the circuit and find where the break is. On the Game Gear I've been working on, there was actually no continuity between pin D4 of the RAM chip and the same pin on the cartridge connector. That pin D4 traced up to that via just above the chip in the photo here, and turns out even though that via looked okay, it did not test okay with the multimeter. Once I repaired that via, I actually got the cartridge to finally boot. The game is clearly booting because it's playing the audio. Now we're going to go over the case where your game is booting, but you're not seeing anything worthwhile on your screen. This is a fairly common issue, and luckily most times it's pretty easy to resolve. I have some photos from the Retro 6 wiki that I'm going to be using as a point of reference. This first photo is for the 2 ASIC model. If this is your model, go ahead and orient your motherboard in the same way as shown in this photo. You're then going to want to do a continuity check from the top of C38 to the top of D2. If there is no continuity there, go ahead and run a jumper wire from those 2 points. Likewise, you're also going to do a continuity check from the top of C37 to the left of C52 and run a jumper wire if there is no continuity again. For one ASIC model Game Gears, orient your motherboard as shown in this photo, then check from the top of C47 to the right of C60 in continuity mode with your multimeter. If you don't have continuity, run a jumper wire and hopefully this gets your screen working. The Game Gear I was working on also suffered from this issue, and doing this jumper wire is what finally got it to more or less fully work finally. So that was the final piece of the puzzle, and there we have it. That's how you can get a Game Gear working if it doesn't work after you recap it. Those are several things that you can check that are pretty straightforward, easy for beginners. Probably the most difficult thing with that process is if you do have some vias that you need to repair. That does involve some micro soldering. You don't necessarily need a microscope for that, but it is very helpful and I would recommend having one. If you don't want to deal with any of this and you just want to get your Game Gear recap professionally and just get it working, I'll have a link in the description to my Game Gear recap service and I'll get you taken care of. With all that said, if you have any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll get back to you when I can, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.